Hey everybody, and welcome to today's episode of the Daily Breakdown. I'm Hunter Lee. I'm joined by Thorin, Spellsy, and Copenhagen Wolves Youngbuck, and we're going to go over all the action from day 3 at Worlds, and really spend most of our time not focusing on the games today, but looking ahead and to the wrap-up of Group A and Groups A and B in the first weekend, and talking about what we've learned so far. So we're pretty much settled into 4 teams. For Group A, as expected, Samsung White and Edward Gaming. Samsung White is locked in for the next round, and Edward Gaming looks like they're going to advance. And then for Group B, Royal Club has locked in, and TSM is locked into the next round. The exact standings aren't set yet, but we're seeing the teams that a lot of people predicted. So let's just start in Group A. Thorin, Samsung White looking really dominant. Anything jump out at you so far, surprise you in their play, or is this what you expected to see?
Actually, they've just been... the thing is, you can't ever say Samsung White is perfect because they do play such an aggressive, risky style that even against bad teams, you saw they'll give up kills, and they will have fights where... Like, there were times when they played against, I think it was AHQ, where AHQ and Dark Passage actually had times where they could have a chance to get a kill, whereas versus a normal team, you're like, right, we're getting back in the game. But Samsung White overall is so good that it doesn't actually matter, it seems. Like, except for Edward Gaming, really the other teams, it was just inconsequential, the matches they played, it seemed here. They were just that far ahead that they could almost... It had like an exhibition feel when they played those bottom 2 teams, I thought. Even the picks they did, it looked like they weren't fully serious, it seemed.
Yeah. Youngbuck, I don't know if did anything jump out to you. I know we've really only seen them in one meaningful game against kind of a top tier level, but in that Samsung White EDG game, what did you see there?
The first game they played against EDG, they looked on almost a similar level as Edward Gaming. And then they had a game against HHQ where they got far ahead early on and kind of started not playing so serious. So when they played against DP today, it was a very good sign for them that they actually played serious from the start to the end, and that's probably a wake-up call that they had against HHQ that they can't fool around too much.
Yeah. Spellsy, jumping out at you, Samsung White.
I thought they looked strong, and they looked really, really dominant against the lower teams. But I mean, that doesn't really say much. But one thing that is a little bit concerning for me is their like throws against Edward Gaming. Like they were ahead really. Oh, did my
I think your mic
headset cut
just
out?
went off.
Oh god. Okay, anyway, I think they were really strong in the lower games, but against Edward Gaming, they kind of did a little bit of throws that makes it kind of nervous for when they like go against if they meet Blue in the semifinals. For some reason, kind of White has been hyped over Blue, and I don't know. We'll have to see.
What about Edward Gaming then, their rival? They in Group A, they were in the game a little, although that might have been more of Samsung White kind of keeping them in the game and Imp sort of getting caught out of position a couple times. But what have you seen there, and do you give them any better odds in their rematch against Samsung White this time, Spellsy?
I think they will probably. I don't know. I still think Samsung White's favored for that matchup. It's kind of hard to tell though. You can't really say much because it's not like they've learned anything from before. But maybe they are better at adapting.
Thorin, anything that would give you hope if you were an EDG fan, or give you pause if you were a Samsung White fan as they potentially have a rematch to tie up Group A and force a playoff for first place?
Yeah, I mean, this is one of those games, that first one they played, where, to me, the interesting thing is like which team will have adapted from the first game, because actually both teams have something they can learn, even though it seemed a bit one-sided. Like if you're Samsung White, you know that if you actually make mistakes late game and you let it get late game, actually EDG was pretty good in those late game team fights. So if the game was close, then you know you might be able to lose under those circumstances, whereas before you could run over everyone who wasn't called Blue, basically. So I think on the other side of things, if you're EDG, now you know you probably have to play ultra safe early game. You have to get Nami into like a good lane and get him ahead in CS and just make sure that you can't let what happened before happen, which is like your main strength actually get a bit behind, and then Samsung White can just run all over you. So actually, to me, it reminds me a bit of like if you watch like a playoff series in the NHL or the NBA or something. Once you've seen the two teams play, you know like the levels of the players, but then you want to see who makes the adjustment for the next game when they play. Like, is it the team who lost? Because sometimes people say that the team who lost is the one that usually will make the adjustment because they know what they did wrong, whereas the other guys think they can just replicate what they did there. So in that sort of a scenario, in theory, that could close the gap a bit for EDG. Maybe they know how to get the game to the late game now against Samsung White. I still think Samsung White will just win it anyway, so I'm not sure it'll matter. I think there's enough of a gap, they'll win.
Yeah. Youngbuck, what do you think about Thorin's? If you're EDG, do you know you have to go in making changes, and what do you think those are to sort of catch up or do better in this second game and maybe claw your way into first place in that group?
I have a lot of trouble getting a read on Edward Gaming. In their opening game against Samsung White, I thought they were surprisingly strong, even though the loss seemed very one-sided. I felt like they made some mistakes in Champion Select, but overall, and then with the picks that they did have, they didn't play the comp as well. So when I just had to judge that game, I thought that they would actually have a chance of beating Samsung White if they had to play again right then. Then they had to play some of the weaker teams, and I felt that they had really slow starts, and that's kind of surprising because the skill gap should be a lot higher. So seeing them losing lanes against weaker teams and falling behind a bit is a bit surprising. I hope that it's a mental thing, that they just want to play very safe because they know they'll win once it gets to mid to late game. I still think Samsung White is a very heavy favorite, but if the Edward Gaming from the first game shows up, I do think they have a chance.
Do you think the format, Youngbuck, is a disservice to them in this case, where they don't have the opportunity to play a second game right away and potentially capitalize on those things? Or is it the reverse, where they're having more time to think about it and potentially experiment with things against minor competition, they're better set up for that rematch?
No, I think the setup is fine as it is.
Fair enough. So Group B is totally settled. Royal, and TSM. We don't know who's going to get first place yet. Technically, it's just like Group A. The both teams could tie for first place if somehow TSM were to win their rematch with Royal. Spellsy, what did you see in Royal Club that stood out for you, or is this pretty much what you expected?
I mean, one thing that really, or not really surprised me, but surprised me somewhat is people were kind of diminishing Insect's kind of power level, and they were saying like, you know, ever since he moved away from Korea, he's kind of been a little bit weaker. But I think he has been like really strong, and I've been actually like surprised how much their bot lane can win these 2v2s despite having like a Chinese and a Korean laning together. So I mean, I think they actually surpassed my expectations coming into this group. I thought they wouldn't go like undefeated, but here I could easily see them going undefeated.
Duncan, do you agree with that?
I just want to know what reality. I'd like to go into the old paradigm of Spellsy's mind there, where he looked at this group and saw TSM's bot lane, SK's bot lane, and TPA's bot lane, and was like, you know what? I think this amazing Chinese AD carry is probably going to struggle in this group. How's he going to keep up with Candy Panda? Like, you know, Tristana's in the meta. He got the first competitive pentakill on them in season 1, I believe. Like, what world were you living in, man?
No. The other three teams have like terrible bot lanes.
No, they have bot lanes. They have average bot lanes for their regions. They have okay bot lanes. Okay, the problem is the one from the Royal Club gun's really good. So actually, what's funny is, in a weird way, as impressive as Uzi's been and how great that bot lane's been, I am not actually still super sold that like he's the best AD carry yet, for example, as people were saying on the broadcast, because I want to see him go against like Samsung bot lanes or play EDG again if they play him in the playoffs. That's when I could really get like a gauge on how good they were. Whereas at the moment, you can just see from the games, it almost looked like at times in the Samsung in the Royal Club games, like as long as it got to the mid game and they weren't behind, they were going to win because they had Uzi I, you know, like they just had such an advantage of that one position.
Yeah, and I do think, I mean, don't think we've been there for the full season, but I think this World's playoffs is really showing that you can still carry out of that bottom lane. I mean, NALCS, I think the LCSs, we talk about this a lot, really focus on the mid and jungle synergy, and you hear about that, and you hear about that, and you hear about that, and Royal Club's definitely proving that other method. Youngbuck, have you noticed that in Royal Club's play a real shift in their strategy that allows them to carry harder from bot lane?
I think it's just a change in the meta. I think a lot of power has shifted towards the bot lane with champions like Tristana and Kog'Maw running around. and they often get free lanes. There are a few very dominant lanes that can beat them, but most of them require a Nami, for example. So people who grab Nami are just going to get a hyper carry and scale very well into late game and have a big impact.
And what do you make of the Janna pop-up here? It just seems to sort of come out of nowhere, and suddenly it's getting banned. It's, you know, like a really desired pick. I was certainly surprised to see that take off.
Janna has a good matchup against Zillion and Thresh. It's lanes that she can survive, and that was usually her weak point. She excels at team fighting and skirmishes with multiple people involved. However, her laning was always very weak. Her lane swap was very weak. But now that she has a few favorable matchups or matchups that she can easily survive, she's picked a lot more often.
Do you expect, or would you, I mean, what's the counter then, aside from banning it? Is it possible for the meta to shift this rapidly in a tournament and for Janna to catch on in the early rounds and then people to figure out what the counter is and start playing that as we go deeper into the tournament?
I think the main thing is that Janna is more of a counter pick. A lot of people can pick Nami or Sona into it. Lulu works very well. Just poke style of champion. But because teams put a lot of focus on Zillion, for example, people can get to pick Janna and have that favorable lane.
Fair enough. Spellsy, TSM, I think a lot of us had them getting second place. Not everybody. I think Duncan had SK getting second place, and we can circle back to that. But I think a lot of us had TSM getting second place. Even with that, their play has been a little up and down, but recently more consistent. What do you think the difference is there that's letting them secure that second spot?
I think we saw this a little bit in the playoffs where they get better as the kind of group goes on and they kind of at least solidify their play style somewhat. I think we're seeing that, but I think it's just a skill gap. Like with SK, with their sub jungler, I think TSM just outshines them, and I think TPA has been a kind of a dud so far in the group. I still don't think they're going to have much of a chance versus Royal in this next match because of the skill gap again. I think they're just right in between Royal and then the SK and TPA.
Duncan, would you agree with that? TSM just outclassing TPA and SK so far?
For TPA, I think, like overall, if my comments on TPA would be, I think they were a bit overhyped by people who thought that they were going to be more of a dark horse than they were. I think the only reason they ended up being a dark horse was that it looked like Royal Club cruised when they played against them, and then it seemed like SK's sub problems is mainly what made the games closer there. And so I actually think TPA would have been like convincingly fourth if the Svenskeren incident hadn't happened. In terms of TSM, yeah, I think TSM overall just like actually that's why TPA were a bit underwhelming to me. If you just looked man for man, the TSM players just looked stronger. Like the mid laner for TPA just wasn't comparable to Bjergsen. You could just see that. And like, yeah. I actually said this on yesterday's show. The problem with TPA is their first game kind of gave us unrealistic expectations, I think, because in that game, they had a couple of players play really, really well. And beyond that, I think you saw that, okay, the Winds guy, he actually looks pretty legit. Maybe he would be a star if he was in another region on a good team. But everyone else in the team is actually kind of just like, for Western regions, they would just be mediocre players. I don't think they have a good enough team, you know, to make it. Even though they've had some good moves in the actual game, like just the team isn't strong enough for them to win these games, I think.
So what happened if the peak potential is there? Like if the first game they looked so good, how come they weren't able to bring that in the other games?
I mean, remember, they looked good and they still lost the game. Like, they looked good for 30 minutes and then they lost in every possible sense. I mean, remember the famous quote? Like, Kobe had a really good quote in that game where he said that Taipei Assassins were, like, leading for 30 minutes and they couldn't figure out how to win, and Royal Club were leading for 30 seconds and they won the game. Like, something like that. Like, it was a very witty way to put it, you know. To me, that was kind of like the difference. It's like, if you're going to be a weaker team, then you have to be better at the objective control and the strategy and close the game out. You have to take your little advantage and definitely close the game out. Whereas the problem they had here was they could make plays. Like the difference wasn't ridiculous in terms of skill, but I actually don't think that they knew what to do. Like I'd guess in their region, because they're convincingly the best team, they just have the same scenario as Royal Club does, where you just get so far ahead, you just win the game anyway. You don't have to close it in some super meticulous, like close the deal A, B, C in order. So I think that's their problem. They weren't good enough, and then They didn't have the strategical advantage, which is, I think, why people overhyped them, because they were mainly overhyped because people mentioned this side factor that they brought in this Najin Korean coach, and maybe that would have some influence in it. I'm sure it had some influence, but I don't think that's enough to just make you win the game, when you're playing superior players.
Right. Youngbuck, TSM's gotten a lot of credit for their strong laning, which maybe they deserve and maybe they don't deserve, and a lot of criticism for their shot calling, which maybe they deserve or maybe they don't deserve. But what do you think, what's your sort of sense of TSM's play so far, and really on those two, whether their shot calling has improved or whether they're just dominating from lane and kind of individual skill?
The first 2 games they played, they were pretty sloppy, very chaotic. However, they seem to be growing into the tournament. The last 2 games, they played 2 different team comps, played both of them exactly as how they're supposed to play. So I think they're looking very strong. Their shot calling does seem to be pretty good. I think their laning overall is decent. I mean, Bjergsen is always going to be that monster. Today we saw Dyrus having good matchups and winning his lane convincingly. I think they look decent. They have a chance against Royal, but I'd definitely say that Royal is still a favorite.
Yeah, I mean, you definitely saw in today's game against SK or TPA, Bjergsen was able to get a solo kill, and then they rolled to Dragon from there. That was against TPA and sort of were take the game. So he does seem to be carrying them pretty hard. Spellsy shot calling, again, one of their things. Does this seem like a new TSM from the one we saw in playoffs, or do you have more hope if you're a TSM fan that they've figured something out?
No, I don't think they really figured anything out. I think, especially in the game we saw today, they just kind of won all of the lanes and then just kind of played their comp fine. They just grouped up and kind of let Wild Turtle auto attack people. I don't think they're like blazing any new shot calling, like super decisive moves or anything. What was actually maybe a sign of good things was they had a little bit of a different comp yesterday with the Rumble and Janna, and they played that pretty well. But I think Vander said last episode that like they got a good strong early lead, and if they didn't get that, they probably would have lost.
Yeah, but they got, in today's game, both Janna and Rumble were banned out by TPA, I guess, in fear of that comp. Youngbuck, if you go in with a certain game plan in mind and then Champion Select doesn't go the way you go, how hard is it to adjust on the fly and fall back to something that maybe you weren't necessarily preparing to play in that game?
Well, if you're at Worlds, you have to have several different team comps, different strategies, so it shouldn't hurt too much. I think that when the Janna and Rumble were banned, they realized they weren't going for poke, so they pretty much counted the Xerath out and then went for the Orianna, more for team fight. They added Lulu, and when Lulu Orianna can protect an AD carry very well, so they went more for a protect the AD carry comp with a lot of damage on Orianna as well, of course.
Fair enough. So Thorin, obviously you have had you've been critical of TSM and also very complimentary of them over the course of the season, and I think we've been kind of waiting to see how all of Reggie's roster moves and bringing Loco in and all of that would pay out over the year, and whether it would pay off at the end with them advancing. For the first time in 2 years, winning games, getting out of the group. Is this a sign that Reggie was right to do all of these things, and that he should get some real credit for making the team better than it was a year ago?
I think there's three ways I would divide this answer up. On first level is like, was it right to do that in terms of moving on? Yes, because it's had the result. It's got the better result than past Worlds, etc. But I think then you have to add in the caveat that the whole SK scenario and what we saw from TPA means that it's not as though they came in. If they'd have gone into Group C and they'd have gotten out, then it would be a very overwhelming, yes, what an incredible set of moves. Because actually, the team they had before, when he was playing as the mid laner, if you put them in even this group now, maybe they wouldn't have made it out. Maybe they would have been too far behind and they wouldn't have had the necessary power to make it through. I think that's probably true. Like I say, the SK issue, actually, from the way SK played, I think it would have been contentious as to who got that second spot if SK had Svenskeren for all 6 games. So that wouldn't necessarily have vindicated the moves, even though they would have still been good in their own merits. And then lastly, I'd just say, yeah, overall, the trend was definitely right. It did improve the team. I don't think they would have even qualified for Worlds actually if they hadn't have made some of the moves they made. But then again, within that, they made some moves that I don't think necessarily made sense. Like for example, if somehow they could have just kept it special, I think they would have been just as good, if not maybe better. So it's a bit of a mixed bag. But overall, yeah, you have to give overall good marks to Reggie. He did the right moves. I think actually, if you look at all the top teams from that last year, they're the one who made the most improvement. So I'll give them marks for that.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly was. I was very skeptical of the Lustboy change, given how close it was to the end of the season and then playoffs, and it was very skeptical of their ability to incorporate a new player with a potential language barrier and get him settled in. Spellsy, what's your take on these roster changes and the decisions Reggie's made overall?
I kind of agree with Duncan, where I think if Xpecial could have stayed, this would have probably been the best timeline or whatever. But I think overall it was rather. It made the team better. The real question is, so last year or the last two splits, NA has never gotten past where they were seeded, and so people are hyping that finally TSM got out of group stages, and I'm not sure if that really holds weight. I think that it might be a little bit of a luck factor because they got like these really easy group and they got the Svenskeren problems and all this, and the new format making group stages kind of easier to get out of.
I mean, Spellsy, put it this way, if we put the TSM team of last year, who was the second best NA team, in this sort of a group, they probably also could make it out as well, right? That's like a fair way to say it, right?
I think that's a good question to ask, definitely. I mean, my assumption is yes, they could. Youngbuck, I don't know, how much of this do you credit to luck, and how much do you think this is really, the team is better this year, and that's why they're performing better?
I think it's a bit of both. I definitely see a lot of improvements in TSM, but it's undeniable that they have a bit of an easy group to get out of. It's also why I'm pretty hyped about tomorrow. I really want to see how they perform against Royal Club. Not just for the standing, but I think that it will really show where they stand now. They've been given a chance to grow into the tournament. They've beaten the bottom two pretty easily, and now they have to show against Royal that they are actually growing into it and are a team to be feared in the quarterfinals.
Yeah, let's say they lose to Royal tomorrow. They go to the corners and they get, I think if everything goes right, they get blue in the next round or something like that, and they get swept right away. Is it still a success?
It's a difficult
Duncan or Youngbuck, is it still a success if they don't win any more games from here? Technically, they advance, but they don't win any more games.
I think it'll depend on how other Western teams perform, and at the same time, you could say that TSM did win the season, so that is an improvement from last time.
Duncan, let's say this is the high point right here. The second place, advancing on, nothing more happens. Does that change your perspective on any of this?
Not really, because then you'd have to say who did they beat, and they beat SK with their proper lineup for one game, and then they beat TPA twice. Assuming they lose to Royal, this is. Listen, if they can beat Royal even in the group stage, and even if they go out in the quarterfinals, that result alone would be worth something, because Royal's clearly proven themselves to be a good team and potentially a top team. Actually, I think, believe it or not, coming first place in this group is actually absolutely vital if you're TSM, because if you come second, then you get Samsung White most likely, which is like automatically, I don't think anyone would give them a chance to win that. Whereas if you come first somehow, if you can get the tiebreaker against Royal Club, you might be able to get Edward Gaming. And listen, I still think they'd lose that, but that's at least you've got a chance. Then maybe the dream's alive to go to the semis. So I think that would be the key thing there, is that there'd be a dual factor to if they could beat Royal Club. That would really prove themselves, and it'd give themselves a better chance to prove themselves. Whereas if you lose against White in the round of 8, it's not like I would hold that against them and say they're bad. I think almost everyone's going to get smashed by White if they play in a best of 5.
So on that level then, what, if anything, could TSM do, Spellsy, to do better in this next round and get themselves maybe into the lower half of the bracket where they have a chance?
I mean, it's kind of tough because they got crushed so hard in the first game against Royal, but I think they're going to have to fend off the early game from Royal, to be honest. And I think you can't let NSEC get Rengar, of course.
Yeah, certainly he's the only one who seems to want to play Rengar in this tournament. And while the announcers are really hyping up that play, I it didn't seem like he crushed super hard today, but he's certainly had some great games. Youngbuck, when you're dealing with a champion or a player like that who has these one particular champions, is there any reason to just not ban it out? Or is it possible to let him get Rengar and build a strategy around him, definitely picking it if it's available to him?
Definitely ban it. However, TSM might have gone into the game with the mindset that they could deal with a Rengar, or feel that Insec has other champions on a similar level as his Rengar, and then decide that it wasn't worth the ban. But I think they've learned from the last game, and they will ban it this time.
Yeah, I would hope so for their sake.
Well, I mean, one of the problems is that Insec is obviously very famous for the Lee Sin. So let's say you ban Lee Sin. Well, now what if they ban Elise? You just took out Amazing's 2 champions there. So you're actually kind of risking it if you waste a ban on Rengar, I think, if you're TSM. Whereas, who knows, maybe you'd rather ban the mid laner, the Korn out, and then hope that you get Bjergsen in a good matchup, you know?
I think the good news is, I think they played Royals on blue side last time, so I think they're on blue side this time, which will be helpful for them in the pick ban phase for Lee Sin specifically.
Okay, well, it should be a great game tomorrow. I mean, looking ahead, we have those 2 matches. Maybe anything else tomorrow that any of those other games that you think are should watches or must watches? I'll start with you, Duncan. Anything aside from those 2 matches that you're looking forward to?
Just for interest value alone, I actually wouldn't mind seeing the SK versus TSM, the final game of the group, when SK finally have the proper jungler in. Because these were the 2 teams I thought were going to be battling for second place. And actually, I made this point. I thought it was pretty close. Like, I edged SK because I thought, like, my biggest criticism of TSM is always that the late game shot calling's a bit iffy, whereas I think that's one of SK's strengths. So even though SK can't go through, and even though by that point, presumably TSM's already through, I think that, like, if you're SK, you don't just give up. You want to at least try and show one good game, and you want to, if you can beat TSM, who's going to the round of 8, you have shown something, you know. Like, then you could at least, actually, if you're SK, it allows you to then put the excuse out there, like, oh, you see, if we'd have had the lineup for the whole time, we could have done this. So I think that will actually be a competitive game, and it's NA versus EU. Like, those games are never going to be just a joke. I would hope. I'd hope people will actually want like some bragging rights and to at least say, well, we beat you with our real lineup and all that good stuff.
Youngbuck, you know the SK guys. They definitely seemed demoralized by the circumstances this week and what it did to their prospects in the tournament. But do you expect them to finish strong and really try to make a statement in their final games so that looking ahead to next year they can say, like, we had a chance and shit happens, but we could have, we'll be there this upcoming year and really show everybody?
I think that now they've beaten TPA, they want to show that the suspension had a lot of influence on the way Worlds went for them. So they were probably demoralized at the first 3 games, maybe even against TPA, but now they'll probably look to give it everything they got again.
And do you think the results would have been different if they had had Svenskeren the whole way? The results, at least so far, do you think they would have gotten second place or first place or advanced?
It would have been a lot closer. A lot of games were not lost because of Svenskeren not being there, but SK has been a team for an entire year that has had a very straightforward strategy that revolved around Svenskeren and Freddy. So when one of those 2 players is missing, then that's a really big hit for a team. So they would have definitely done better. They could have competed for second place, I think. But if they would have made it, I'm not entirely sure.
Spellsy, what do you think about that? Is SK, I mean, based on what we've seen so far, if they had their original lineup, do you think things would have gone differently?
I mean, I still predicted TSM over SK even before the Svenskeren thing. But, I mean, tomorrow will really show, like, with the TSM-SK match, we'll really see, like, if it would have gone differently. Because, I mean, I think if SK wins that match, then there's a strong argument for that they would have gone second.
Yeah, I guess. Do you expect Salt to ramp up in the NAEU argument and people to really throw that in TSM's face even more if they kind of back into the next round, losing to Royal Club and losing to SK and advancing anyway?
Yeah, I think people would just say the TSM conspiracy, getting the no Korean group, and then somehow the jungler got suspended. Yeah.
Fair enough. I I think it's been an interesting 3 days of action so far. But personally, I've been disappointed by what feels like a lot of meaningless games. Duncan, we were talking about this a little before the show started, but the tournament format has left a lot of teams just kind of out there playing games and sort of created a soft group in Group A, and then this Group E which a lot of people consider to be soft. What are your feelings so far on the format and how it's played out over the first weekend?
The funny thing about the format is 3 of the groups, okay, should have been like contentious, like quite interesting. Like Group B should have been. I mean, at the end of the day, if SK had Svenskeren, then with TPA having some of these games that, okay, they lost, but they were close for a while, and you'd have been like, wow, the 4th best team's doing this well. That would have been exciting. Every game would have been like, you couldn't have taken it for granted even if you were TSM and SK and you beat each other, you might know that, okay, if the other guy loses to TPA and I beat them, that might be enough, So I think overall, it would have worked out. The big problem is, I've made this point actually on Summoning Insight before, when they made this stage where they made the 3 pools to make the seeding from. So they had pool 1, pool 2, pool 3, and you have 1 team from pool 1, 2 from 2, and 1 from 3 to make up the 4. The problem is Group A is basically a nightmare scenario of what the worst almost that could happen from there is. Because what you ended up with was the absolute worst team out of pool 2, along with one of the worst teams from pool 3, and then 2 of the absolute best teams from pool 1. And no, the best team from pool 2 and the best team from pool 1. So you had almost the best teams you could get with the worst teams in one group, which, now listen, that's not going to happen very often. That's actually quite unlikely it would happen. But it's a flaw of the system, because you can end up with a group like that. Whereas instead, I would prefer a system where even if you have pools, you somehow seed within the pool. So if you do get Samsung White out first, then it means you're going to get, okay, you'd have one of the bad teams from pool 3, but then you'd have quite competitive teams from pool 2 to make it so there would be 3 that could still get out there, essentially. And you could do that to all the groups, because in an ideal world, I think in 14 group stage, you want at least 3 teams to at least be in contention for a playoff spot. It's when you know for certain that AHQ can't get out. Now, I mean, a lot of the criticism of Edward Gaming, okay, hasn't been like, wow, they played underperformance. It's been like they didn't stomp hard enough versus the bad teams. Like that's not a good context to have, for a world championship.
We have seen a lot of stomps. Like today was almost all stomps. We've had 18 games so far, and like maybe 3 or 4 of them have been like competitive games that had, real meaningful impact on the results of their group. Youngbuck, what's your thought on the format? Do you feel like it's good for Worlds as a tournament that there are teams like Dark Passage and AHQ and Kaboom later on in the tournament that are being mixed in with Samsung White and those kinds of teams?
Well, there are teams that are not even in contention for leading groups, so that's a bit annoying, I suppose. Like, I'm sitting here at home while a team that couldn't make it in the European Challenger scene is going to Worlds now. On the other hand, I do think the argument to have teams from all over the world is a great idea. So from that standpoint, I really don't mind seeing a Turkish team or a Brazilian team. However, they should have probably add 2 more wildcards in that scenario, so they are actually equally divided. Every group gets 1 team they can easily beat and then compete with the others. Yeah, it's a bit hard.
I think that's a good idea, actually. Just have 5 teams in a group and have 1 be a wild card.
Yeah, I mean, in a sense, it would be there'd be an equally bad team everywhere that's providing equally poor competition with everybody. But I have to wonder, the announcers were talking today about how, like, it's, these teams are really going to benefit from their time at Worlds, and, like, Dark Passage will go back to Turkey.
You remember when Gaming Gear EU got into LCS and they had that really good playoff performance, and you remember the Gamma Bears, they're a very good team, and, I mean, SK,
right.
we all know that they came back stronger, and
They brought it back to the region to improve.
Right. I mean, I assume that's total BS, but Youngbuck, do you think there's any possibility there that a team like that goes to Worlds, gets stomped 6 straight games, and is, like a better off the next year for having that international experience?
I think so, and we've actually scrimmed against Dark Passage a few times, and they're not a terrible team at all. They are a team that can definitely compete in the challenger scene and maybe look to go into the LCS. However, they're not quite there yet. But maybe this experience will help them. I hope for them that they've been scrimming top-tier teams. I know that last year that Gaming Gear was only scrimming Mineski because other teams were just refusing to scrim those two teams. I hope it's a bit different this year, and that the wildcard teams learn a lot.
I couldn't blame a high-tier team from not taking scrims with Dark Passage. Spellsy, I can't imagine. I mean, these games don't look competitive, so I assume the scrims would also be not very good for tuning up before Worlds.
Yeah, I don't think even in LCS, I'm pretty sure, I don't know, Youngbuck will actually know this, but I feel like the scrim schedule is pretty limited in that you don't usually select teams that are not up to stuff. So I think when you're practicing for the biggest tournament of the world, you shouldn't just give pity scrims or whatever.
Pity scrims. Right. Well,
But,
I mean, I think go ahead.
I think on the tournament structure in general, I don't know. I think it's kind of a disappointment. I think Riot tried to make this global event and put that kind of in front of the competitiveness. And so now I have like my casual LoL friends or whatever, and this is the biggest tournament of the year. I should be like, oh yeah, you guys need to watch these games. They're so hype. Like this is the time to watch League of Legends. And if they do, and they tune in to the Samsung White versus Dark Passage, and it's like, what am I watching? This is the most boring thing ever.
Or
It's
even
like,
AHQ versus Dark Passage.
yeah. The 50% of the games today were like completely kind of useless in that they were like Dark Passes versus Samsung White or AHQ versus EDG. It's somewhat unlucky, like Duncan said, it's very unlikely to get this kind of terrible organization of groups. But I personally think that once it gets to the Worlds and there's like this big event at this big venue, that's when the games should get good. You shouldn't have to wait until the playoff stage or the bracket stage or the finals for the games to get good.
Because then you end up with the same criticism you kind of had last year, which is like TSM only played 3 or 4 meaningful games and they lost them all and they're out and you're done. Like Cloud9 will have a lot more meaningful games in Alliance in their regions and stuff, but these two groups didn't really generate a lot of really good competition. And I guess you don't want to like overcorrect for that, but it does seem like a flaw in the setup that your opening weekend of Worlds was for the most part pretty boring, at least so far.
Yeah, and I think that I don't even know that's fully corrected because last year Cloud9 played 3 games against Fnatic. This year they could easily play 4 games and 2 against Kabam, which are useless. But they would only play 2 games against Alliance and then 2 games against Najin, and then you're like, okay. And then they're done. It's like, all right, we saw them play those 2 best of ones against 2 different teams.
Yeah.
But I think that while the global aspect is really nice and like Youngbuck said, it gives like experience to these teams, I think they need to have a play-in before the tournament where you take maybe the 4th place from all the other regions and then you pit them against all the international things, and there's like their stage to shine, and if they can get through the weaker teams from the major regions, then they can play in the big tournament and show competitiveness.
Okay. Well, that probably wraps up for today, but before we go, let's do final predictions for tomorrow's action. Duncan, for the 2 groups, who do you have first and second in A, and who do you have first and second in B at this point? Can you see Royal Club, TSM or EDG climbing their way into first place somehow in either of those?
Of the 2, I think TSM's the more likely to be able to, but I still don't think it's going to happen. I think it's going to be White first, EDG second, and Royal Club first, TSM second. Like, I think just overall that's how it's going to play out. And I am really looking forward to the White EDG game regardless, though, mainly because they're 2 contenders for the tournament, so you just want to see them as like a playoff preview,
Yeah, almost all of us had White and EDG making, the later stages of the tournament, not necessarily playing again. I think the tournament prevents that, but progressing pretty far. So I agree that should be a nice high quality matchup. Youngbuck, what do you think at this point? What are your 4 teams? How are they going to stack up at the end of the day tomorrow?
I fully agree with Thorin. If there's going to be an upset, then it's going to be TSM beating Royal and taking first place. Other than that, it's going to be White, EDG, and then Royal TSM.
Spellsy, fully agree. Any upsets possible?
No, I agree. I think the thing hasn't been mentioned is that even if TSM beats Royal or EDG beats Samsung, then they're going to play a tiebreaker, and then they're going to have to play again and beat them again. So they're like kind of like a best of 3 and they're down 1 game.
So it's pretty unlikely. That's what I'm hearing from you. Yeah, I'm on the same boat. I'd love to get more games between those teams if they really are going to be that close, and get a better look at them, since they won't get a chance to play again. But it doesn't seem very likely. Okay, well, that about does it from here. On behalf of Thorin and Spellsy, thank you, Youngbuck, for coming on the show. And we'll be back tomorrow after the games for another breakdown. Thorin will return to hosting, so Twitch chat can get off my back for however terrible of a job I'm doing. And Spellsy's off the show tomorrow. Tomorrow, Duncan, you're joined by Kelsey, which will be really great because she'll have a ton of perspective on how this EDG compares to the EDG she was watching during the regular season, and same for Royal Club. And who else is on the show tomorrow?
The guest is LS, formerly known as Last Shadow, ex-coach of Super Hot Crew. And so we all know he'll have an interesting perspective on Samsung White and other Korean people. So tune in for that.
Okay, so that'll be great. So we'll have a real international flair tomorrow, and we'll be breaking down the results of Group A and B in the first weekend, and maybe looking a bit ahead to next weekend. Thanks, everybody. You can follow all of our content here on Twitch when we're doing live streams at twitch.tv/ongamers and at ongamers.com.